Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steven once again with Nascar Know-It-All. I hope everyone's doing well today. I know it's been a little while since I've been able to do a show, but I'll try to get back on this on more of a comforting uh, transition here to try to do this a little bit quicker and not be so far behind like I have been. Anyways, so we're on to round two in the NASCAR chase for the Sprint Cup Series. This is the contender round. Now, with 4 drivers eliminated after last week, we're down to just 12 drivers to contend for the championship, in what may be the most challenging and difficult round in the chase. Kansas and Talladega lurk in this round, and in the last 4 Kansas races, there have been 44 caution flags. That averages 11 per race. Running nearly 255 laps of caution in those 4 races, that's almost an entire race ran under caution. That means not only could Talladega be a serious lottery race, but so could Kansas. So who's going to escape this round? We'll just have to wait and see. So, today we're going to talk about the races at Kansas. The first race at Kansas happened in 2001. That was the inaugural race there. And props out to Jason Leffler. May God rest his soul. He sat on the pole for the inaugural race in 2001. Fun fact about Jason Leffler, he won his first career race in the NASCAR Busch Series on June the 12th, 2004 at the Nashville Superspeedway. It was June the 12th, 2013, though, when he went home to heaven. Anyways, that inaugural race in 2001 at Kansas saw a driver who was from a very close town to Kansas City, Rusty Wallace from St. Louis, Missouri, looked to be on his way to his second win of the season. He had the dominant car, he led most of the race, and surprisingly his teammate, newcomer Ryan Newman, was also a serious challenger in this race. Newman was only making his 4th career start. It looked like Penske Racing could potentially have a 1-2 finish. It wasn't to be. On the final pit stop, Rusty Wallace would be speeding, and he would have to go to the back of the field. He'd managed to come back to finish 4th, but Ryan Newman would actually lose the lead to Jeff Gordon in the pits on the final stop. Newman would keep pace with Gordon on the final run, but Gordon would come home to his 6th win of the season, leading to his 4th championship and thus far last championship. Newman would finish 2nd that day for what would be his best career finish up to that point. The next season, Newman would run for Rookie of the Year, and he would defeat Jimmy Johnson for Rookie of the Year. That's right, he defeated Jimmy Johnson for Rookie of the Year. In 2002, the series came to Kansas in one of its closest championship battles the series had seen in some time. In the race, Jimmy Johnson was 2nd in the points coming in. Actually, I take that back. He was not. Sterling Marlin actually entered this race 2nd in the points. Mark Martin was the points leader, and Jimmy Johnson was 3rd. Sterling Marlin would actually get in a wreck early in the race, making contact with Jeff Burton. Some people actually criticized Burton, saying since he was Mark Martin's teammate, did he do this intentionally? I really don't think Burton would have. He just doesn't strike me as that kind of guy. In the race, Johnson ran subpar. He would come home to finish 10th. Bill Elliott appeared semi-strong, but the strongest car throughout the day appeared to be Ryan Newman. He was looking for a 2nd career victory, and he challenged most of the day. Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be for him, as Jeff Gordon would end up winning the race, coming on strong in the later half of the race. But what this race will forever be known of is all the crashes. Only 25 cars finished this race. 25. That's not very many. The reason I remember this race most was Mark Martin was my childhood favorite, and he came in here as the points leader. With 25 laps to go, he was running in 3rd, and he looked like he was going to leave here with a huge points lead until his engine decided to give up. He would still finish 26th because so few cars even finished, but this was the race where Tony Stewart gained enough ground on him that the championship, the momentum swayed Stewart's way and away from Martin. The 2003 race at Kansas also was a bit of a heartbreaker. Matt Kenseth was my 2nd favorite growing up. He's my favorite now. He would end up being in a wreck in practice. Coming into this race, he had a massive 400-plus point lead up for the championship. But after wrecking in practice, he'd go to a backup car, and he would end up wrecking in the race, getting into an accident with Michael Waltrip. He would finish 37th, multiple laps down, and from this point on, it was definitely difficult for Kenseth to hold on to win the title, but he would do so. In the particular race, Ryan Newman would finally seek a vengeance, and he'd go to victory lane. But he didn't have as fast of a car this time as he had been. The Evernham Dodges of Bill Elliott and Jeremy Mayfield appeared to be in a zone all by themselves. They were running very unique paint schemes that day also, celebrating the new Lion King movie. Bill Elliott's car was so fast, I didn't think there was any way on earth he could lose. But on the last caution, everyone pitted but Ryan Newman. Bill Elliott was the first one to come out of the pits with 4 tires. He restarted 6th, but he never had enough time to get back to Newman. Newman would pick up the win, unbelievably his 8th win of the season. I remember Alan Bestwick calling the race and said as Newman crossed the finish line, "Can you believe it? They've done it again," referring to how Ryan Newman and then crew chief Matt Borland were able to use pit strategy, old tires, and fuel mileage to their advantage to accompany 8 victories in one season. By far Newman's most stellar season to date. The 2004 race at Kansas brought a little bit of a different spark. It was the first time Kansas had been in the chase. Of course, it was the first year the chase had ever been implemented. This race was one that we haven't seen too often, only about 25% of the time. A non-chaser would go to victory lane. Ironically, though, those non-chasers going to victory lane seemingly have been more common at Kansas than really anywhere other than maybe Talladega. In this particular race, Joe Nemechek started on the pole in the U.S. Army Chevrolet for MB2 Motorsports. Joe was already having a great weekend. Not only had he won the pole, he also won the NASCAR Nationwide Series race the previous day, holding off Greg Biffle on a photo finish. In this particular race, there were several challengers. Jeremy Mayfield appeared strong. Greg Biffle came on real strong. He even led the most laps. Mark Martin on long runs had a phenomenal car. But all of them had problems, the way the cautions fell. The last 100 miles had so many cautions, it took them all out. Kurt Busch, the points leader, had a serious scare when Jimmy Johnson would spin out right in front of him. Martin would have to take evasive action as well, and he would have to go to the back of the pack. Johnson would end up getting a little bit of damage, but for all intents and purposes, his day was done. Busch dodged this and finished 6th. It's amazing he dodged this because he only beat Jimmy Johnson for the title a few weeks later by 8 points. This race very well could have been the determining factor. Anyways, as the race wound down, a lot of drivers used fuel mileage to get to the front, including Joe Nemechek. Nemechek had to fight off a hard-charging Ricky Rudd in the final laps to win. Nemechek drove as hard as I've ever seen him drive, and he held off Ricky Rudd to pick up his 4th and so far last victory of his career. In my opinion, though, winning at Kansas was probably his most impressive, because in the other 3 races he won, 2 of which he had by far the dominant car, Rockingham in 2001 and Richmond in 2003. But just like his win in 1999 at New Hampshire, he had to race hard and earn this win. Don't get me wrong, every win would be difficult, but the fact that you really have to give it, some athletes have that ability to give in and get more out of the car than what it's actually giving you. And that's what Nemechek did that day, so he really earned that win. 2005. This was a race that Roush Fenway Racing looked to dominate. They dominated the mile and a half that year, and with Matt Kenseth starting on the pole, it looked to be no different. In this particular race, it saw a lot of green flag running, and track position was so vital. On the second run of the day, Mark Martin's crew decided to roll the dice and take 2 tires. He came out of the pits with the lead. He had started 19th, but he'd only managed to work his way up to 9th up to that point, and he was really having a hard time gaining positions any further. From that point forward, this was shortly before halfway, Martin led the whole rest of the race. In fact, he basically drove away, but in the end, Greg Biffle did start to run him down, and he even made the finish exciting, but Martin would hang on to pick up his 35th career victory. As far as the Roush Fenway dominance go, Mark Martin won, Greg Biffle finished 2nd, Carl Edwards finished 3rd, Matt Kenseth finished 5th, and Kurt Busch finished 8th. They were definitely very strong for the Roush Fenway cars that day. In fact, the total laps led, they led practically the entire race because Kenseth led the first 86 laps from the pole. Biffle took over from there till the next pit stop. From there, Martin led the whole way except for green flag pit stops when people stayed out longer. Fun fact, this was actually the first race Denny Hamlin ever raced in the NASCAR Sprint Cup Series. Could he win this weekend? He's a former Kansas winner. 2006. This was a race that came down to fuel mileage once again in the chase. Jimmy Johnson dominated this race, and he looked like he would win the race going away. But the final pit stop came with 70 laps to go. A few drivers couldn't go that far. In fact, nearly all of them couldn't. Johnson had to pit extra. Burton, who ran strong, had to pit again. Biffle, who ran strong, had to pit again. In the end, though, Tony Stewart, it was Casey Mears driving the 42 at the time, not Jamie McMurray, and Mark Martin and Dale Jarrett all made the final 70 laps without pitting again. They were your top 4 finishers. Stewart and Mears both ran out of gas on the last lap, but they had a big enough lead over third-place runner Mark Martin to maintain their running positions. Stewart was actually not in the chase this year, so it continued that theme of non-chasers winning at Kansas, already joining Joe Nemechek from 2004. Johnson, who dominated, only ended up finishing 14th because he would get a speeding penalty with the green flag pit stop for fuel inside the last 10 laps. 2007, by many people's account, was the most bizarre race ever held at the Kansas Speedway. The race was infected by rain all day long. Kurt Busch had a fast car, Martin Truex had a fast car, Matt Kenseth had a fast car. Unfortunately, it ended up raining during a cycle of green flag pit stops after halfway. Tony Stewart was the leader at the time, Greg Biffle was second, Kevin Harvick was third, Casey Mears was fourth. But when this happened, most of the top runners had already made their pit stop. Jimmy Johnson had, Jeff Gordon had, Matt Kenseth had, Kurt Busch had, Carl Edwards had, all of which went from running in the top 10 to back in the 30s. Miraculously, the rain ended up moving out, and they ended up restarting the race, which I to this day do not understand because they knew they were not going to be able to complete the race. As soon as they went back to green, all of the drivers who had run up front started in front of the leader, and there was a huge crash. Surprisingly, Jimmy Johnson and Jeff Gordon were the lone 2 people to miss the wreck. Other fast cars, including Kurt Busch and Matt Kenseth, were involved in the wreck. Johnson would make a tear through the field, coming back to actually finish third, looking like he'd be able to win. Kevin Harvick looked poised to pick up his first career victory at Kansas, taking advantage of what had happened. I did forget to mention Tony Stewart was even caught up in that wreck on the restart, because if you remember, this was when the cars who were able to stay out under caution, they actually restarted in front of the leader. And that's why when the wreck happened, Stewart was in it, because he was actually behind these cars. It wasn't like today with the wave around where the cars could go and restart behind the leaders like they do now. But anyways, Kevin Harvick would not win the race. He would lose the lead to Greg Biffle with 22 laps to go. A caution would come out for debris with 5 laps to go, and it looked like maybe Greg Biffle was in trouble because Jimmy Johnson was flying and he was up to third. As it turned out, NASCAR decided never to restart the race because of darkness. But on the last lap, Biffle's car slowed under caution, and second place Clint Bowyer and third place Jimmy Johnson decided to pass Biffle under caution on the last lap. Johnson says Biffle was out of gas. Biffle said he was instructed over the radio to go ahead and unloosen his belt because NASCAR had run so far over on TV time. Nevertheless, if you look this race up today, the record book shows that Greg Biffle won this race. Again, another non-chaser going to victory lane. The 2008 race, by many people's accounts, is considered the most exciting at the Kansas Speedway. The race was kind of boring in the midsection, but Carl Edwards made up a huge deficit near the end to challenge for the lead. Now, on the final pit stop, though, even though Edwards had come to the lead at his home track, he came out of the pits in second. Now, Johnson managed to run the perfect race up until the last lap. But on the last lap, going into turn 3, Carl Edwards tried to run the last corner wide open. He would end up hitting the wall, much like a video game, but he knew he would hit the wall. He expected to bounce off the wall and keep up enough momentum to keep the lead. As it turns out, he did not keep up enough momentum, and Johnson would go on to pass him coming off of turn 4 to win the race. Edwards would have to settle for second at his home track. For time limits, this will be the end of part 1 for NASCAR Know-It-All with Steve, Kansas edition. So long.